And the delegates, the people who are involved in the climate talks, as opposed to the activists in the streets. Something interesting that happened 10 years ago with the Battle of Seattle that also turned things were those inside who were saying, you are not listening to us. I mean, developing countries, for example, countries in Africa. What about those countries here, their role at the climate summit in Copenhagen?
Well, you know, it remains to be seen. As I said, some of the most interesting solutions are being put on the table by Latin American governments like Bolivia, also Ecuador. But what we just saw in Barcelona, which was you know, the last major negotiating push before the meeting in Copenhagen, is that the coalition of African states walked out of the summit en masse. So it's basically a form of civil disobedience within the summit in protest of the very low commitments for emission cuts coming from the developed world, which was interesting that the African bloc walked out, not because there wasn't enough money for them, not because there wasn't enough aid for them to deal with climate change, but because they don't simply want aid. They want us in the rich world to actually change our way of life, because they are facing the effects of that. They're on the front lines of climate change. So, you know, I think we may see more of that in Copenhagen, but I'll tell you, Amy, there was quite a bit of political fallout for the African negotiators for walking out in Barcelona. Some of the negotiators were recalled by their home governments because they faced backroom pressure from Washington and the European Union, like get your climate negotiators under control. So I'm a little concerned that, you know, we saw that in Barcelona. Maybe we won't see that level of boldness from the African delegates in Copenhagen, but certainly on paper, what they have been saying is that if they don't believe this is a good deal, they will walk out.
Issuing it, no logo at 10. The subtitle of the book, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies. Talk about what happened in Seattle. Talk about this whole issue of branding.
Well, you know, Amy, the reason why I said yes when my publisher asked me whether I wanted to do a new edition, write a new introduction, I said yes because it feels like the right moment. It feels like there is something to learn from that political moment in 1999, 2000, when not just Seattle, but this movement against corporate power was exploding around the world. You know, many people date the beginning of it to the Zapatistas in Mexico, but we saw every time there was a International Monetary Fund summit, a G8 summit in Genoa, there would be these convergences of activists on the streets putting this economic model on trial. We were called by the media anti-globalization activists, but we were always very clear that we were not against globalization, we were against corporate rule. We were questioning capitalism, this unregulated Wild West capitalism that was being spread by institutions like the World Trade Organization, like the International Monetary Fund. And what was interesting, Amy, you know, think back to Seattle, 1999. We were making these arguments about corporate rule, but we were making it at the height of an economic boom, at the peak of an economic boom, in a boom town. I mean, Seattle was the center, along with Silicon Valley, of the dot-com boom. So there were a lot of people who were really willing to defend this economic model. And here we are 10 years later. And it's a really interesting political moment. And this is why I did want to reissue the book and did want to reframe it, because I think the arguments that we were making, and we were really treated like these radicals. I always remember that Thomas Friedman called us flat earthers in the New York Times, and that was before he wrote a book telling the world that in fact the world was flat. But you know, we were called flat earthers, we were called extremists, but here we are in a moment where it is absolutely a mainstream political opinion that there has been an utter integration, merger between corporations and government, a takeover really. The arguments that we were making 10 years ago about the failures of this economic model are now mainstream arguments. But yet the mass movement that we were a part of 10 years ago really isn't present in the streets. And I think a lot of that has to do with perhaps the Obama effect in the United States, where everyone is still in this waiting pattern, hoping that he's going to save the day. And that's, you know, another reason, Amy, why I think Copenhagen may well be a turning point, particularly for young Americans. Many young people worked very, very hard on Obama's campaign. And a large factor motivating them was their concern about the environment, their concern about climate, and they really saw Obama as an alternative. There's a lot of issues where you can make an argument about what is politically feasible at a certain time. But when it comes to climate, and I think a lot of young people feel this, there really isn't much room for negotiation. I mean, this is something that Bill McKibben's been very clear about. You can't negotiate with the science. It doesn't go by Harry Reid's timetable. So one of the things I think we're seeing from many of the young people who worked on Obama's campaign in the lead up to Copenhagen is they're returning to the issues as opposed to just being sort of foot soldiers for the Democratic Party. And that's, I think, one of the things that was exciting about the actions organized by 350.org earlier in the month, which were last month, which were focused on a scientific target, right? The 350 target, as opposed to focused on what John Kerry wrote an article a couple of weeks ago calling on young people to organize to get his bill through the Senate. But the problem with the bill that he's pushing through the Senate is that it actually won't meet the needs of our climate crisis. So I think young people are increasingly returning to the issues, as we were 10 years ago in Seattle, focused on the issues, not focused on any one political party or their needs.
Naomi Klein, I wanted to talk specifically about the kind of branding that you begin your introduction with at No Logo at 10. How branding has changed. Give us some specifics.
Well, I mean, it always branding is expert at absorbing its opposition. So I gave a couple of examples of companies that had gone no logo. Of an example of Absolute Vodka taking their label, their logo off the bottle, and Starbucks opened, interestingly, in Seattle, a store without their brand on it at all. They're trying to make their brand disappear. So you have this evolution in corporate branding. But what I decided to focus on is not how the latest gimmicks and techniques of corporate branding, but rather how politicians, and indeed how government has absorbed the techniques honed by the corporations in the 90s in creating and selling their super brands, and now they're being used by political parties, by politicians, really to sell themselves. And I'm afraid I think that's where Obama fits in, that he really is a super brand online with many of the companies that I discuss in No Logo. And he has many of the same problems as the companies that I discuss in No Logo, like Nike and Apple and all of these, Starbucks, all of these 1990s sort of lifestyle brands that co-opted many of the iconography of transformative political movements, like the civil rights movement, the women's movement. I mean, that was really the hallmark of 1990s branding. And one of the things, and it's a large part of what I write about in No Logo, is the absorption of these political movements into the world of marketing. And the first time I saw the Yes We Can video that was produced by will.i.am, my first thought was, wow, a politician has finally produced an ad as good as Nike that plays on our sort of faded memories of a more idealistic era, but yet doesn't quite say anything. We think we hear the message we want to hear, but if you really parse it, the promises aren't there. It's really the emotions. And I think that explains, in some sense, a paralysis in progressive movements in the United States, where we think Obama stands for something because our emotions were activated on these issues, but we don't really have much to hold him to, because in fact, if you look at what he said during the campaign, like any good super brand, like any good marketer, he made sure not to promise too much so that he couldn't be held to it. Afghanistan's a very strong example, Amy. I mean, it's hard to build the case that Obama is breaking a campaign promise when, in fact, he is doing what he said he would do during the campaign, even if he made us think that he was a pro-peace candidate, even if he used the iconography, the imagery of the peace movement, even if he, it's the same thing with labor, si se puede, yes we can. This is the imagery of this is the slogan of the farm workers, and even, Obama's, the famous
5 seconds,
the famous poster, this is like the poster of Che, but this isn't a real social movement because it never made those transformative demands. And that's what social movements have to do. We have to get back to basics, Amy, and we'll see it in Copenhagen.